Good morning, everyone, and greetings. I'm Joe Waters, the co-founder and CEO of Capita, and we're delighted that you have joined us for this post-election briefing with a handful of experts and collaborators whom we have worked with at Capita here in 2020. Last week's election resulted in the selection of Joe Biden as president for the term beginning January 20th, 2021. And yet many were hoping for a clear repudiation of Trumpism in last week's election, but some 70 million Americans cast their ballots for Trump and likely have returned control of the Senate to the Republicans, thus frustrating hopes for a more robust, progressive agenda and requiring bipartisanship if we are to move forward. Trump may be defeated, but Trumpism is not. The election was closer than many observers anticipated, and our country appears as polarized as ever. Many of Trump's supporters, for example, seem to be rejecting the election's outcome, while Biden's supporters took to the streets over the weekend in celebration. How might we go forward now to rebuild a culture of solidarity and reweave our badly worn social fabric, which is evidenced by the divided vote? Ian, can we start with you? Ian, we need you to unmute.
Very sorry. Thanks, Joe. Sorry about that. I think one thing to say is that fixing things on a national level is such a big thing and probably just beyond any of our capacities to really affect in a meaningful way. But I think on the community level and those around us, especially through COVID, I think we've seen a sort of upsurge in awareness of those responsibilities that we bear towards each other and the good that we can do in our local spot. I think a renewed focus on that would be really salutary, not least because it would get us away from our screens. And I think that, insofar as there is this terrible and growing polarization, most of it happens via the digital representations of ourselves that we put out into the world, on social media, for instance. I think there are real areas of diverging interests and serious disagreement between different parts of the country, but the enmity and the sense that we're surrounded by monsters, that's largely a digital artifact. And so I think as much as possible, if we could get away from our screens, stop thinking of everything in terms of national politics, and kind of focus in on what's around us and the people around us, I think that would be a very good start.
So Jackie, I'm going to turn now to you, please. Jump in here. You're in the middle of the country at the University of Kansas, very conservative state, very red state. What's your perspective?
I agree with a lot of what Ian said, and I don't like the way the polarization feels, but we also know what we're dealing with now and know what we need to do to move forward. I would say in the sense that we have to quit the gloating on Facebook and on social media, and also really to start taking it local. How can we start metabolizing this fear and threat as opportunity? And it also seems that people aren't really able to dream big anymore. And we're so stuck into this oppression and this political and economic quagmire that we can't think about any alternative future. And I think that's where, in my role and the work that I'm doing on the state level and with organizations, that we need to be that beacon and not of telling people it's going to be okay. Because we need to do something about it. But I think this is a critical moment when we need to pivot and we need to stop reinforcing what we're against and start talking about what we're for. And I'm not going to be in my role a bridge blower upper by any means, but we also have to start saying, what is this next more equitable, fairer system going to look like? And I'll just leave it with this. I've been reading this book called Ministry for the Future. It's a sci-fi book and it's about climate change. I don't know, Patron, if you have been reading, I see you smiling about that one. It's really encouraging in the sense that it's an apocalyptic utopia, and things went to hell in a handbasket, and it's not one grand plan, but it's people all around the globe doing forward.
Wonderful. Great. Patron, yeah, please.
No, I was just smiling only because I had seen you tweet it, Jackie, which it looked really good. I haven't seen it yet, but actually I did. The other day I was listening to a webinar where there was Nigel Topping, who used to be the chief executive of one of the big climate advocacy groups based in the UK. And he is going to be using futures thinking and sort of speculative fiction thinking at COP26 to try to get people dreaming about this bigger future. Just as you say, I think building that new positive vision of what things could be is really critical. Absolutely, as you say, along with just listening. I think the thing that I thought when the election results came through, and it was really, as you said, Joe, pretty close in a lot of places, I was thinking about the people that I know back in the US who have been working really hard to organize and just kind of out there going after every vote. And that just involves literally knocking on doors and talking to people. I think having that one, it's just hard work, but having that one-to-one interaction is going to be absolutely critical to get us through this period.
I know that I think we've always thought we're on the endeavor of being an issue-centric, issue-based society where we debate the issues, but I don't honestly believe that's the reality. We have almost something close to idols that we that we get behind and we support. We're for him or her and we're against him or her, and I've been struggling over the last week to think about what we have to do differently to have it be about an issue centric, about debating an issue, about being for or against an idea, rather than a person who's somehow attached to it. So I've been thinking for the last 48 hours since you asked us to be part of this conversation about how do we take the spotlight away and the spectacle away from the people in this and actually bring the issues up to the forefront in the same, with the same sort of just rapt attention that we've all been giving the individuals to give the issues and debate with those. And some of the things I've been playing around with is, I don't know how people feel about it. I don't even know how I feel about it. You're asking a lot for us to have this all figured out 1 week later, Joe. But I do think, I think about our work and how we get our work done and the principles of design that we use in the work in the various sectors that we represent. And we use focus groups and we use conversations that have, that lead up and are iterative. You don't drop a proposal and be like, bam, that's what we're going to do. It's an iterative process, and you braid and you blend ideas and information into it. And I think that we are being let down by our public representatives in their effort, in their lack of effort, frankly, I think and I think that's on both sides, lack of effort to do that. And I think we need to sort of blow up the idea that these people, we elect them, and therefore then they know what our decision making would be in any given conversation, and that's the end of it. I think I want to see representatives representing us in a much more active way, where town halls don't only happen in the election year, that discussions don't only happen in written guidance reactions that the federal government drops down and we all scramble to write reactions to. I think it needs to be much more of a conversation that iterates over time and includes people and their perspectives on the day-to-day, and not these, sort of big platform approaches that seem to have gotten us to a very, very divided place. So I'll stop there. Sorry to ramble.
I don't think it's rambling at all. I think you're spot on, Brandy. I sort of see the same thing, where we get too sort of tied up in the identity and kind of the cult of personality. But I actually don't know that we can necessarily, in my mind, we almost have to lean into that. Like, I don't know that actually that's a modern phenomenon, because I mean, human psychology, right? Like, we tend to, it's tribalism. Like, you can go back and, I think Jonathan Haidt, in The Righteous Mind, does a really masterful sort of exposition. You can almost track this back evolutionarily to sort of why humans act the way we act. But I think what has changed over the past 20, 30 years, and particularly over the past 4 years, is you get, it's the sort of fruit of the big sort, right? So we're all in our echo chambers. We don't live with people who think differently than we are. We don't use different media sources than people who are different than we are. And so one thing you see in the public opinion polling, right, is you look at like the 70s, and you think the people who would describe the other party as like, I have hatred towards them, or, like extreme negative feelings, was actually not that high, right? Like, most people like, I disagree with the other party, but like, I don't think they're bad people. And kind of to Ian's point about like the demonizing. And now it is like, it's getting pretty extreme, where it's like, no, they're like, you are a bad person if you are on the other side of these issues. And so, I think a lot of this is, how do we come back from that? What kind of structures can we put into place that we, create intentional interaction with other people, where we humanize it, where we get the opportunity to start to sort of build social ties in different ways. And I actually think, Joe, some of the work that the Capita does around families is particularly interesting, because family is a place that I think you can find sort of one of, I kind of call it the last bastion of bipartisanism sometimes, right? Like childcare is something that like affects people in Kansas as much as it affects people in Massachusetts, or issues around, wanting to have, a city or a town that has, family-friendly infrastructure. I like what the Van Leer Foundation does. They ask that question, like, what does the city look like if you see it from the height of a 3-year-old, right? And so I almost wonder if we can use the sort of the family as a frame to bring everyone kind of down a little bit from the valence that they're working at.
I think that's really interesting, Elliot, because it has the potential to move us away from, and this is something else I've talked about, a focus on programs, right? And two, a focus on outcomes for not just children, but for the family unit, right? And to create policies that are, as Kathy Myers with the Family and Home Network always reminds us, are truly inclusive, right? And so, Ian, I want to get you in here on this, both what Brandy said in terms of representation in a more active way. That to me sounds a lot like a need that we have to, and I believe that this is our friend Pete Davis's terminology, to deepen democracy, right? First of all, and then to what Elliot is saying as well, that our present arrangements are not conducive to supporting the family. And you wrote about that for us earlier in the year. So I'm just curious, these are conversations you've been having with us at Capita throughout this year. I want to get your sort of post-election reflections on some of the things you've written for us already in 2020.
Sure. So I think, as I've expounded in writing a couple of times, I think the deck is stacked in a lot of ways against family flourishing and against local community flourishing as well. Some of that is sort of macroeconomic, and I think we should be raging against it and writing and voting and acting against it. But some of it's not. Some of it's not quite so insoluble. So, as you know, Joe, I've been rereading Robert Putnam's book Bowling Alone, and there's a lot that maybe he wasn't entirely right about, but some stuff that seems incontrovertible is that there has been this real contraction of local civic engagement over the past several decades. And that means that we tend to encounter politics not on a personal level, right? We're not like trying to push so much for developments in our community as we are to, advance the visibility of some issue that we like, or denounce some individual or party that we don't like. And so there are two very reliable reasons that he could adduce, or that seem quite steady for these changes. And one was television. It seems like you can index pretty closely the decline of local civic engagement with the rise of television, which came onto the scene and then saturated the American market within 5 years. It was incredible how quickly it spread. And so just on a really mundane level, like we're just spending time not with each other, neither with each other nor alone with our thoughts, right? We're sort of live in this perpetual state of being kind of privately stimulated and entertained. And that keeps us from getting out there and doing like politics on the localist level, which, you know, even just sort of working on our neighborhoods and our communities. So, I mean, I think this was originally written long before the rise of the internet, and now it's, as we all know, even sort of has a bigger chunk of our inner lives locked up, this kind of private entertainment and private stimulation. So one small and easy thing is just to turn it off and get out there a little more. So, I mean, I think that's hard, you know, maybe easier said than done for a lot of us, because a lot of us are probably clinically addicted to these sorts of stimulation. But that's at least one thing we can make a difference with, I don't know, before we kind of attack the macroeconomic problems.
And Joe, I would add to that of like, as we're looking at, you know, what is next and what we're going to fill with this gap, what are the new mediating institutions? Because unions and churches aren't as present in a lot of people's lives. So when we're talking about the family, though, how do we connect the families and get the network of families and create that social fabric at the local level? So the informal networks that we know, and from our own research, that families rely on way more than government help, and that's, you know, what they expect.
I don't know if this is related or not. In my weird little mind, it is. But I think another thing I've been thinking about is we operate like we make rational decisions based on an intellectual framework. But we all know that we don't. We make decisions based on a mixture of rational intellectual thinking and feelings and perceptions and our perception of what we are experiencing. And I've been really like unpacking what I think the word disenfranchisement means and how it is. I mean, if you think about it, 100% of the country right now feels disenfranchised for very different motivations and reasons, right? And I also think of it as being both a condition of the mind and the condition of experience. And I think we have a huge problem of 100% disenfranchisement, and folks are, as a result, are operating probably more on the continuum of feelings of fear, pain, suffering, all of those, than on this supposed rational intellectual endeavor of democracy. And so until we really sort of devise a democratic process or a process around making decisions about policy, which is, to my mind, the only antidote to that, is we've got to just embrace that people are not making decisions the way that we would like or we think that we do. And so that's why I really liking what Ian is saying about the only way we can get past that is to actually spend time with each other and experience, as human beings are sort of wired to do, the experience of neighbor, the experience of other, the perceived understanding of what others are feeling they are subject to. And, you know, that could be very Pollyanna-ish of me. It's also kind of doomsday. I mean, I'm very scared in a situation where we've got 100% disenfranchisement, and I'm really searching for the light in how to address that, because we can't continue to keep doing the same thing and expect a different result, especially now, and it's quite sobering.
I think part of that too, and it is sobering. I think there's almost a chicken and egg piece here, where the sort of the macroeconomic policies, the policies that our country chooses to enact, I think, you know, either presses on or releases pressure from those feelings of fear and those feelings of scarcity, right? All of those sort of negative milieu of feelings that put us into a crouch. And so, you know, and you've got, you know, I think Arlie Hochschild, when she wrote Strangers in Their Own Land, right? And basically her talking about like the deep story that like conservatives, and she was profiling them in Louisiana, were feeling about basically like, I'm doing everything I was told to do, right? Like I went to school, I worked hard, I work hard now, and like, yet I'm not getting ahead. And I'm actually seeing these other people who don't look like me get ahead. And I'm being told into that like gap, what I'm being told is that's because they're jumping the line, because in like, that's, right, that leads you down a certain path. That story is not happening of, actually we have extremely corporate friendly, policies in place, and there's like, lax regulation, et cetera, right? You can tell another story to explain why that's happening. And similarly, I think we know, obviously, like we haven't touched on this explicitly in the conversation yet, but, deep disparities along racial lines that, as a result of very intentional legacy of very intentional policies that are being set. So when I think about, I think it has to be both and, like this layer of like neighbor and like person to person connection has to happen. There's also a barrier to that if we have policies that are keeping people in deep poverty, that are keeping people from being able to have mobility, that are keeping people, in sort of this sense of like, this isn't going well, and therefore I'm looking for a reason it's not going well, and I'm being told it's because of them, right? And so I think we have to approach it too when we demand things like a child allowance, when we demand things like fair housing policies, when we, those things actually I think are intrinsically tied to this idea of how do we rebuild the social fabric. So I just don't want us to sort of separate those out too far.
Ian, you look like you want to say something.
I don't know how to do it, though, Elliot. I mean, I know how to write some articles, and we can keep doing that stuff. It is a really odd situation where I think most of the big differences are not about policy right now, and they're not about how we should fund childcare or something. It was such an odd phenomenon that a lot of the people in the American South who voted against Bernie Sanders, like if you ask them step by step about his policy agenda, like, do you want universal health care? Like, you go through, they're like, oh, absolutely, I love that stuff, right? And like, I think, the primary campaign we ended up having wasn't about policy so much. It really was about enmity. It was about like, Trump is just embodied enmity, right? He's just like a middle finger to smart people on the coasts in nice blue button-up shirts, kind of running shit for running things for their own benefit and talking down to people. And then, I don't know how many people actually voted for Joe Biden. I think most of them were voting against Donald Trump. And it really is this clash of sort of archetypes and personalities and cultures. And yeah, I honestly don't know what we can do right now about that. I mean, I think speaking candidly and vulnerably in public is good. Like I've tried to write a little bit about that. I think being more human with each other as much as possible is very good. But how to bring together the people who, think that like a boat parade for Trump is an awesome show of strength versus the people who think that it's just absolutely vile and disgusting. Like, that's to me, that's the work of the next few decades. And I have some kind of intuitions about it, but it's a heavy lift.
Great, thank you. Let's talk a little bit about some policies. Patron, the United States left the Paris Climate Agreement last week officially, and President-elect Biden has indicated that we will rejoin that agreement on January the 21st. You and I have been talking consistently over the last several years about climate change as a child-focused issue that we really don't treat as a children's issue, at least in the United States. What are your hopes and fears about real action on climate change, and specifically the possibility for building climate-sensitive child policies and child-sensitive climate policies moving forward?
Well, so it's interesting, actually. I've only recently actually been working on climate, and I came through it through working on early childhood. So I've always been a very people-focused person in my work. And even though intellectually I knew that climate was an issue, it didn't sort of get me in a really emotional way until I started learning about the impact that climate change, and specifically on air pollution, which was one of the big kind of most immediate effects of climate change that most affects young children has on the way that on child health. And so the reason I mention that is because actually starting to work on air pollution, which is what I'm doing now, actually gave me a huge amount of hope, because I think that seeing climate change as a children's issue through, for example, the lens of air quality or other immediate issues that are affecting children really has potential to bring together people from all different political stripes and so on in a way that I think is really unusual. I know it sounds a bit utopian, but we do see that in many places where actually talking about air quality and then specifically talking about the impact on children, which is another very unifying issue, is really powerful. So already before I was having some hope through working on air quality and seeing some of the amazing things that you can do in the short term. And then of course, with Biden's re-election, I think whatever you think about that, it's sort of very clear that this is definitely the best outcome of the election from a climate perspective. The US is going to go back into Paris. There's a whole bunch of things that Biden can do even without going through Congress to try to improve climate policies in the US. So I think that's a really positive thing, both for the US and for the rest of the world. I think my fear is that it's a little bit hard to get your head around what climate means for children. I think if you were a climate policymaker, because you're very used to thinking very, very high level, literally atmospherically, and children, of course, people are on the ground. And so thinking about how it affects specific people is, I have found a lens that climate policymakers aren't used to taking. So there's really something there about helping them to better understand the impacts on specific groups of people. Yeah, I'll stop there for now.
Well, I just wanted to follow up too, Patrick, because your work at the Bernard Van Leer Foundation was also focused on urban design and place and building places that work for children and families. I think one other thing that we've seen in this election is the persistent divide between rural and urban, and a sense for many people that who live in rural places that the system, whatever that is, just doesn't work for them and for their kind. And so I know that you were focused at Bernard Van Leer on urban 95, right? Urban context. But what lessons do you think we could extrapolate from that for places that are suburban and rural to make sure that we're moving policies forward that where places, all places, work for families and children?
Yes, that's a really great question. Let me think about how to respond to that. I think I probably would start by coming back to something that I think you said earlier about, yes, you said earlier about moving away from a focus on programs and towards outcomes for the family unit. And a lot of, I'm sure there are other people on this call that can speak much more to the place-based work that a lot of early childhood policymakers and advocates have been doing, where they're looking about outcomes for families with young children across an entire community unit and building programs across a range of organizations and government departments on that. So there's kind of just thinking, literally putting the child and the family at the center of policymaking and looking at what that does. And I think so there's two things there. One is recognizing that children are actually very key rights holders as well. I know that's very United Nations language, but often children get very lumped up into just kind of random vulnerable groups of people. And actually they are a specific group of people that they may not be able to vote, and their parents might be too tired to go to town halls, but they still have very much a stake in what's happening, and they have just as much a right as anyone else to all of the rights that we have. The second thing is, I would say that we really learned with the Urban 95 work is recognizing the very specific physical needs of children. So one of the most fascinating things I learned, for example, was that a lot of transportation policy is designed around typically the man who's commuting in the morning, going home 9 a.m., 5 p.m., and that's how bus schedules and whatever are set up. Whereas actually, if you're looking at the way that caregivers travel, they're traveling off-peak hours, they're making really short trips from childcare to home, to the grocery store, etc. And there are actually things that you can do with, for example, the way that fare structures are set up or the way that bus schedules are done to help to accommodate that kind of travel pattern. But so much of that is invisible when it comes to urban planning. So one of the things that we were trying to do is make that more visible. And I think that translates just as well to rural policies as well, I would imagine.
That's great. Wonderful. So I do want to pause here, and it's 30 minutes after the hour. And so we do want to hear from you and receive your questions. We have 2 folks who have already submitted, and we're going to get to those here in just a few minutes. But if you have more, or there are others who have questions, please use the Q&A function below to get those questions to us, and we'll start to answer those. Elliot, I'm going to turn to you to answer the first of those about building truly inclusive family policies. And we have previewed this earlier a bit, but I want your perspective, and then maybe Brandy and Jackie, I want your perspective as well on this question from Kathy Myers about adopting principles of inclusion in policymaking for families. When policies are crafted for working families, millions of other families are left out that cross all spectrums, and in particular, those parents who maybe choose to stay at home rather than having their children in some formal childcare setting. So Ian, we'll start with, or Elliot, we'll start with you. Sorry,
Yeah.
Ian.
Yeah, no problem. And also, by the way, I was just going to say, Patricia, I couldn't agree more. It was funny. We talked about bipartisan nature of the climate change back at the beginning of this year. Myself and Lyman Stone, who's a conservative analyst, wrote the same article, basically 2 days apart from each other, about how we could have carbon taxes that you have some portion of the revenue that goes to kids, because that's going to make it way more palatable politically. So just, yes, I think that's a really good point. And yeah, so this thing in inclusion, I mean, I think, to me, like when you center the family, and you, to your point, Joe, not like the program, you center the family, like it naturally leads you down like sort of a both and sort of policy making sort of path. And so yeah, when you talk about universal child care, right, like I think it's universal child care for those who want it. It's also, a home care stipend for those who want to have a stay-at-home parents, but we want to be supporting that choice. It's also having a child allowance, because not all child rearing costs are just about childcare. It's also about finding a way to compensate grandparents, right, or cousins or aunts or whoever else might be taking care of it. We have to be able to hold more than one thing, in our minds at once. And I sort of think about this as when you look at like healthcare, right? Like we have healthcare programs that target the elderly, that target children, that target people with disabilities, that target people, right, in different populations. And so I think when we think about child and family policy, the idea that we could have one policy that's going to reach all of our needs, it doesn't work. But moreover, to sort of the broader conversation we're happening is it creates divisions, right? Because if you're just talking about childcare, or you're just talking about supporting stay-at-home parents, then you're going to sort of get to that infighting. But if it's inclusively, like our mission statement should be every family has access to the type of care situation that they want and need for themselves and their children to thrive, right? That's a very different mission statement. I think that gets you a lot further, and you bring a much broader set of people with you. So that's what I would say, but I'd love to hear, Brandy, Jackie's, other people's thoughts on it too.
Well, I mean, again, I think what you're saying, I'm all for it, obviously, but I feel like that's what we've been saying. And that's kind of where I'm getting at from this notion that we have this intellectual narrative that we tell ourselves, and we say it, and all early childhood is voluntary. Yet we still have this irrational fear that somehow it's going to be, folks have this irrational fear that it's going to be forced on them, or that a lifestyle that they don't choose is something that's becoming mandatory for them. And so I don't know, while I agree with you 100% that that's the premise of how we want to apply our policies, I feel like in many ways we've tried to message that until recently to very little understanding that that's honestly what we're after, and there's still this irrational fear. And that's what I'm sort of trying to understand, is how do we get past the emotional responses that people have to have them hear and see and experience the actual intention, which is freedom to choose or not to choose, or opt in or not to opt in. I think this question of, rural and suburban and urban is definitely something that can be managed by a very inclusive, like I said, iterative conversation about issues and policies instead of about people and feelings. And somewhat, I think feelings are important, but they need to be harnessed and engaged within a set of experiences across a spectrum of people, so that they're fed and pruned according to what that person is experiencing and feeling in the moment of discussion around the policy. I would love to see, like, I'm neglected to say, like, I'm wondering if ballot initiative or ballot type legislating needs to be a bigger force across a wider spectrum of the country, because then you're discussing an idea and you're voting for ideas instead of people in or anonymous bill proposals. Like, what would we do if we didn't know who wrote the bill and just had to deal with the bill? I don't know how we would create that scenario given our, our democratic process and how it's been set up, but those are the kinds of only things that my little mind can think of how to, like, break this very established system of no matter what you say until I don't believe you. And it's stymieing.
The one thing I just add real quick, and then don't want to interrupt you, Jackie, is like, I do think some of it is starting with talking about values and talking about shared values. Because I think, let's just use the childcare example again. Like, I agree with you, Brandy. Like, you and I don't know anyone who thinks that people shouldn't be able to be a stay-at-home parent. But you can tell yourself a story where you say, okay, I'm hearing a lot about professionalizing this workforce. I'm hearing a lot about how, we want to have teachers to have degrees. I'm hearing a lot about how we're going to be publicly basically, expanding public pre-K, et cetera. And you can tell yourself a story where it's saying, okay, well, is that saying that's actually, if you need a degree to be an early childhood educator, what does that mean for a parent or a grandparent? Does that mean that's not good enough? Does that mean that, I shouldn't be doing, am I somehow harming my children? And, and if you follow that way down the path, if you're sort of into the more conspiracy theory, and then be like, okay, are we going to have compulsory? We have compulsory education starting at age 5 or 6 in most states. Is that going to be age 4? Is that going to be age 3? Where does it stop? I think so. It's when you flip it to the value of, look, every parent's going to get to choose the care situation that works for them, and it's going to be, we want to support that. I think that could maybe get ahead of it, but I think that's some of the narrative that gets constructed unintentionally. They're hearing things that we're not saying it's true, but I almost think we have to get in front of it through value language to start. So Jackie, sorry to jump in there.
Yeah, there is so much there that you both talked about. The values piece of it, I think, is critical right now, because Brandy and Elliot, both to your point in the writings that I've read of both of yours, we know what we need to do to solve some of these things, but we have just been so stuck. And one of the things that the pandemic has done is it has changed the conversations, because now everybody is saying that childcare is essential. So now suddenly businesses in rural areas of Kansas are saying, like, wow, we'll support that. And so I see an opening to shifting the conversation to everybody who benefits needs to be responsible, because for so long we have been talking about we need to educate childcare workers. We need, to get the cost of parent or the parent share down, but the math doesn't work on this. And childcare workers as business owners, it just doesn't add up. And so we're going to have to move towards a public infrastructure for childcare. And to me, it also comes down just to workers' rights. People everywhere need to be paid more. When we're looking at all of these intertwined problems, I mean, and our own research just shows that it's these disruptors for families, healthcare, jobs, and if people just had more money, they'd have more options overall too. So I am seeing it as somewhat as an opening right now, and also we personally are not using any of the polarizing language and whose policy discussion it was, but we're talking about what it could do for families in Western Kansas.
I agree that, you know, to be on a more positive note and stop being such a Debbie Downer, I think childcare is a unifying, this cluster, excuse me, of the situation that we're in is the only silver lining is that we are all in it together. And that is finally a moment that we can embrace. And I think childcare is one of the very few opportunities we have to try and build out something that everybody feels enfranchised in, or whatever the opposite is, because of the moment that we're living through. And also, I was thinking when Patron was talking, you know, we're also experiencing a major health crisis. And so it's finally very palpable to people what the implications and the consequences of climate change mean for our children. This type of pandemic type scenario is only going to increase as the planet, you know, warms and more organisms become much more resilient to our attempts to keep them at bay. And so I think, you know, it's an incredible opportunity in this moment of challenge that we have. And there's some particularly bright areas like climate and childcare and healthcare that I think are going to, you know, finally get the light shown on them in a way that has more meaningful support across all the divides.
There's increasing evidence that, so air pollution, like about 2/3 of the causes of air pollution are the same as the causes of climate change. So that's how they're so interlinked. And there's increasing evidence that people living in areas that are more polluted are more likely to get and suffer badly from COVID. So, you know, we're already seeing that. So definitely agree with you there. And as Elliot, Brandy, and Jackie, as you were talking just now, I was thinking that there's a really nice opportunity to reframe childcare in a couple of ways. One is, of course, childcare as an essential part of the federal infrastructure, or the infrastructure wherever you are. And then the second, Elliot, you kept saying a couple of times the right to care. And I thought that was really great. Actually, as I was preparing for this conversation, I came across a poll that the Kennedy School had done in September, which was showing that there was strong bipartisan support for rights, like just the right to clean air, the right to affordable healthcare, the right to a quality education, the right to digital privacy, even if there was a ton of disagreement as to how you get there, but bipartisan support for rights and agreement that they're under threat. So there's something interesting there, and kind of that came to mind when you were talking about the right to care across the life course, actually, not just young children. Obviously, that's what we care about, but all across, elderly, everyone. I think that's a really interesting, powerful framing.
We have another question here about conspiracy theories and movements. And this person is really concerned about people falling prey to them. So the question is, how do we start to confront and break down the barriers created by QAnon and other widespread community conspiracies in a real community level way? And I just want to say that I've been thinking a lot about the strength of our democratic institutions, the fact that our government, particularly at a federal level, seems to lurch from one crisis to another. We haven't had a regular budget process in over a decade. The last major legislation before the CARES Act was passed in March was the Affordable Care Act, which was passed in March of 2010, so 10 years previously. And my view is that all of this taken together, what Lord Jonathan Sachs, who just passed away last week, has called sort of the cultural climate change that we are experiencing. All of that taken together is really damaging for children, but we don't, and families, and we don't really think about those issues as children and family issues. So I'm happy that this person brought it up in this conversation, because it is my view, it is Capita's view, that those are deeply, deeply, deeply children's issues. So Ian, maybe you could start off as the philosopher of culture on this call here on conspiracy theories and how to confront them.
Yeah, so I think there's been an incredible collapse of trust in expertise and sort of according of moral authorities to a lot of our cultural leaders. And I think that actually a lot of it is warranted. I haven't delved too deeply into QAnon myself. I understand it posits that there's a global cabal of elite child predators sort of collaborating together, which I suspect is not true. But I do think that Jeffrey Epstein is a real guy, or was a real guy. And I think that there were a lot of elites who were saying, you know, nice, moral, shiny stuff in public, and at the very least tolerating a lot of really horrible behavior behind the scenes. And I think that, you know, there's been this concentration of expertise and moral authority in places like Cambridge, where I am right now. And I think we haven't earned it. Like, I think we don't deserve it, frankly, in a lot of ways. And so I think with stuff like QAnon, you're seeing a kind of first revolt, like a kind of ham-fisted, over-the-top attempt to develop a different sort of meta-narrative about what's going on in our society. I think either a couple things could happen. Either that grows into like different centers of power where people are actually building good and comprehensive and serious ways of understanding the world that are not centered in Manhattan, Cambridge, and San Francisco. Or maybe we could regain some kind of a sort of shared epistemology, a shared way of understanding what's true and false and right and wrong. I think for that, people in places like Cambridge need to get a lot more careful with their epistemology, and they need to be they need to be a lot humbler about what is visible from here where we sit and what is invisible to us. You see some little bit of reckoning with that. You know, the famous thing of, you know, Times reporters being dispatched to diners in the Rust Belt or whatever. That's obviously, you know, a small start. And there's a lot of sort of infrastructure and inherited authority that sort of will resist against that. But I think, yeah, we need to, I hope we can go back to a spot where there are sort of shared understandings of reality that we can agree on. So that's a small start.
I mean, I don't have a whole lot to add because I think Ian's right. Like, I think some of it too is the media environment is shifting so rapidly. And I sometimes think about that from like going back to even our education system. Like, are we teaching, why is it media criticism, like, you know, critical, the sort of absorption of media, something that everyone is getting? Like, why aren't we having you know, more of an ability to parse that? And I get like a lot of it, to sort of what Brandy's been saying, a lot of it's emotional and not logical, but I do think that like we can build some skills and some muscle in being able to you know, parse what is, you know, more likely to be accurate than what is less likely to be accurate, because this is only going to get worse, right? As these deep fakes continue, as these you know, it gets harder and harder to tell the doctored stuff from the real stuff. Isn't going to get any better. And so, you know, when you think about Gen Z coming up, and, you know, I think they're calling it Gen Alpha. I don't know, Joe, what you and I's kids are a part of, you know, that this is something they're going to have to contend with. And so how are we going to address that in a systemic way, so that they're not, they're able to handle these? Because I think we're seeing the leading edge, I worry, not the sort of, I don't think this is just a flare-up. I think this is the start of a trend.
Yeah, but the urge to develop those wild counter narratives, it comes from a legitimate place, I think. Mm-hmm. Like, a lot of the dominant narratives are really nonsense, right? And there's a lot of like incredible self-enriching and violence that happens under the surface of a lot of that really nice sort of PR polished rhetoric. Yep. in places like the big cities. So like, that needs to change. I wouldn't, I don't blame people for not wanting to pledge allegiance to the New York Times and CNN.
No.
I think there's a lot of dishonesty there. And that's at least one spot that maybe some of us have access to and we can push on a little.
Yeah. Nor do I, again, I go back to the young folks who seem to be, it's interesting, right? You sort of watch the voting shifts, go back to sort of the election piece, right? Of they're no longer sort of, particularly among, I guess, communities of color, like they're the much different voting behavior from younger individuals than from older individuals. And, I get it, like as much as I can as, a white person, that like you could look around and be like, well, this system is not working. Like I was reading when the Washington Post had today some interviews, with some folks down in the Rio Grande Valley, and they're interviewing some young Latinos who had voted for Trump, and basically were like, look, I grew up in this town and like it was completely Democrat controlled and like no one had jobs and this isn't working for anyone. So like, yeah, like why what allegiance do I have to this system that doesn't work? And I think as we see with the Sunrise Movement, when it comes to climate again, right? Like particularly Gen Z, I think way more than us millennials are willing to say there is something very, very broken. I do not accept the premise of your like statement that like we should just go along with the way things are and try to kind of nibble around the edges. And so I do think when you're open to the need for major change, that can introduce some volatility. And that volatility sometimes leads you to QAnon, and sometimes leads you to the Sunrise Movement, right? And like my epistemicity is not super high in this statement, but I'm not sure they're completely divorced from each other. Like they're both very sort of bold, strong ways of trying to make sense of a confusing world that doesn't work for most people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great. We have just a few minutes remaining. If you do have a question, please slip it in. But I have one more question for Patron, and then final thoughts from all of you. And Patron, that is simply, you spent some of your time growing up in the United States, but you live now in the UK. So you are looking at all of this from the distance of the Atlantic. And so would love just the international perspective that you bring to this conversation. Make that a little clearer for us in terms of what are you thinking as somebody who has a deep experience with the United States, but you're seeing it now in this election cycle from some distance.
Oh gosh, well, I can't, I wouldn't pretend to be representing the entire rest of the world outside of the US, but it was very striking to me, just anecdotally, that basically how many of the people in my husband's family who is British, friends and colleagues all over the world were watching this with just pretty much as much nail-bitingness as I presume all of you have been. People were extremely engaged with the outcome, and more than I have seen ever before. Actually, I've been outside of the US for most of the last several elections since 2000, and I think there's just something about there's obviously the impact that US policy has on the rest of the world in terms of climate, but in terms of many other things too. But then there's, I think, also just I really think people are just tired of seeing the level to which the conversation had sunk to in US politics. I'm trying to stay fairly neutral, but I think it's just people were, it's just not a pleasant thing, and it's reflective and probably changing norms. If you see what the US is doing, there's a lot of that kind of move towards the right, move towards autocracy in many other places as well, and it can't be good to be seeing that happening in the US. So I think there's just a massive sense of palpable relief for me.
So I thank you. That's helpful. I typically ask at the end of our online events our panelists to respond to this question: what is one project that you've dreamed of but haven't started yet? That's not really appropriate, I think, for this conversation. And so I'm going to tweak it a little bit and ask you to consider one common project that we need to start as a country. And maybe this election is a starting point for that. Maybe it's going to be several cycles hence. But what is one project of national importance that we haven't started yet, but maybe that you've been dreaming of, that you think we need to start to move our country forward over the next several decades? That is a question I did not give you in advance. So whoever has an idea to share first, please jump in. I don't want to call on you.
I mean, I'll go first. I would like to see, this is my pie in the sky one, I would like to see a bipartisan movement towards a children's amendment to the US Constitution. I think there is federally, we mentioned the word children 0 times as a nation. And I think as a statement of national values and the ability to drive significant policy change, we really need to start thinking about what rights should children have and how do we enshrine them in the federal Constitution. We're way out of line with most of the rest of the world on that.
I'll piggyback on that. We need to ratify the Convention of Rights for Children, or I might be getting that order wrong, but we need to do that. We also need a future generations bill. We need to keep future generations and hold that voice at the table of policy discussions and start talking about our inheritance of the world for our kids.
Brandy?
I'll go.
Oh yeah, Patrick, please.
Sorry. Public libraries. Every community, public libraries. Jackie had asked earlier, what's going to replace the Union or the church as a central point for people coming together, and I'd say public libraries everywhere. And to Brandy's wonderful point, maybe there could be ballots everywhere asking for public libraries. Who's going to vote against that?
Okay. Yeah, did not prepare anything for this. I think we need to recover a kind of like animal embodied sense of each other. I think it's higher friction than just skating around and meeting people online and seeing fellow Americans online. But it's much richer and better as well. And so I heard, and again, I didn't research this, I've heard that once when I think Russia was trying to get birth rates up, they had some period where they would cut off the electricity at night. Is that true? I think that's right. Doesn't matter. But maybe we could have some sabbaths from broadcast and and shut down all social media sites for some period so that we are forced to look at one another again. That's all.
Great. Awesome. Brandy?
Everybody has such great ideas and so positive and bright. A colleague of mine shared last week when we were processing everything that was going on, that it's a grateful and sobering moment in this country. We can have gratitude for the fact that race and power have been sort of broken, the connection between those two issues has been sort of broken open in a way that cannot be taped back up. And I think while that's terrifying on some level, it's also very freeing that after 400 years, we can finally have the discussion that we need to be having sort of on every fundamental level of our DNA as a nation, because it's all exposed out there right now. And it is shattered our sort of fabric, and that's not really a good metaphor, but you know what I mean. Torn apart our fabric. And so the only way out is to weave it back together. And, I think that's terrifying and yet important and compelling. And I feel even more responsible for participating in that. And I think most people, for whatever their motivation, also feel more compelled and responsible for that. So I'm looking forward to the hard work of figuring out how to weave it back together. And this moment has given us that.
Great. Thank you to our panelists, Ian, Patra, Brandy, Elliot, and Jackie. Really wise and bright conversation today, and we very much appreciate your insights. And thank you all who joined us. We look forward to staying in touch with you over the months and years to come, and appreciate you taking time out of your day for this discussion. Have a great rest of the day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.